Isaacs and Zimdardo assembled this earlier criticism of Lord of the Rings in 1968. Essays gathered from 1955 to 1966, including explorations by C.S. Lewis, W.H. Auden, Marion Zimmer Bradley. For this reason alone, the historically first looks at Tolkien are worthwhile reading, as an historical moment in what would soon become a cultural phenomenon. That said, however, don't go looking for any high insights or close examinations of the trilogy. Instead, each critic approaches his or her topic with broader strokes, offering safer claims that to many of today's readers and fans will be completely unenlightening. Patricia Meyer-Spax spends too many pages explaining how the story is a quest for power with the ring at its center. She also goes on to say that the Tolkien reading is weak in its literary merit. W.H. Auden tells us that the trilogy has a large quest pattern similar to many myths. No, I was entertained by these quaint takes on the Master of Middle-earth, reading fairly quickly through the most obvious of passages. More though, I was satisfied to have visited an era where criticism still struggled to make sense of a work fairly new to literature, a fantasy which echoes deeply. Carter, famous for his own series of sword and sorcery works, largely steps away from his own ego-driven talks to offer an historical overview of sources from ancient to modern, which largely fed the Tolkien universe. And that slam about his ego, by the way, is hardly mine alone. He does, in fact, close the book with a few sentences about how his own upcoming works, ones he never completed, will echo Tolkien. Right. But the only real critique I have of this relatively thin book is that about a third of it is relatively useless. He spends 4 fairly lengthy chapters simply summarizing the 4 main books for us. Does he presume that some of his audience are interested in Tolkien without having read a thing about him? I skimmed these, finding nothing original there. What is valuable, though, is that historical tracing. While the real Tolkien nerd may find interest in the origins of names like Gandalf and Thorin, places like Numenor or Mirkwood, broken swords and eternal trees, all of this requiring no small amount of digging in pre-internet 1969 when this was written. What I found most interesting is the tracing of the historical hero and fantasy epic across the ages and regions. This makes itself for a great reading of source list for those seeking early incarnations of literary fantasy imagination. More, Carter's not afraid to share which are more valuable to today's readers and which may be skipped over for their tedium or poor translations. So, while Tolkien's work stands as a pillar dividing fantasy into before and after J.R.R. in the 20th century, it hardly exists in isolation. Linguist and scholar Tolkien intentionally worked to modernize regional mythology, much as Wagner did. But more, Tolkien inherited a centuries-old tradition of infrastructure of epic works which, appropriately, his Lord of the Rings sits atop. Everything which follows, J.R.R., are efforts to recapture his genius, or to make their own space alongside it. Now, when I understood Chance to be a lifelong writer and teacher on Tolkien, and one who based her studies on the works of Michel Foucault, I admit I slathered a bit at the mouth, but who knew how quickly that excitement might run dry? Now, dry is the first word I might offer to describe Chance's approach. For the better part of this work, which feels much longer than it is, she ploddingly assembles her points around the role of power in Middle-earth. She rightly places it mostly in the realms of language and difference, of epistemology and politics, and I would not therefore oppose her approach or even most conclusions. But the results of her inquiry largely fell into territories obvious to lay readers without the Foucault background. Bombadil's joyous language to banish the lifeless Barrow-wights, the illusory power of sight with the One Ring, etc. Chance has the language, but too often her jargon only obscures what must be otherwise pretty apparent. For me, what truly bothered me about her scholarship was the limited reading of power as she approaches Lord of the Rings. For Foucault, there is an ever-dynamic flow of power which itself is not inherently destructive. We cannot and must not fool ourselves to naming a condition as static, but recognizing that it is the arresting or creative energy to power which alters conditions, which moves us to change inside its workings. For chance, little is made of this, and we are left to see particular characters and incidents as ever wicked or ever heroic. What of Bilbo across the epic? What of the biography of Galadriel? Yes, duplicity is a destructive strategy, but does Gandalf never use it? Certainly, much might have been made from Chance's approach, but she treated her analysis as yeoman's work rather than an opening for real usefulness. Well, a lot wrong with a book like this, as many reviewers discuss. Reedy is pompous, self-assured, factually wrong, in need of an editor. Is an introduction or conclusion a requisite for a book? He doesn't think so. And so, overarching in his praise of Tolkien and dismissal of contemporaries and predecessors, that one wonders on what his arguments are based. Has he read Tolkien? It's anyone's guess. Still, we might find in Reedy's rhetoric the traditional British erudite literature, waxing in the parlor one evening about the power of this work of fantasy. In such a venue, he hardly need do more than expound. He has few demands except to mesmerize through words, and he does. And this is not the plain-spoken backgrounder on Tolkien of Carter, Kocher, or Chance, but one who presumes a certain aesthetic sensibility about our beloved fantasy epic. Both reveling, highly speculative late in his career, yes, Reedy is off-putting to Tolkien fans who seek to learn author or trilogy facts, and I'm largely with them. On the other hand, a sometimes poetic and broadening take on a subject that is too often pedantic trivia skirmishes. Now, this is probably the best of several books of Lord of the Rings criticism that I've read. Kocher is approachable, admiring of Tolkien, and expansively thoughtful about the larger scale themes this master of linguistics and storytelling has undertaken. Always cementing his observations with structure, example, and pattern directly from the texts, Kocher demonstrates a moral and cosmic order to Tolkien's universe, reflecting on the role of its denizens through their own parturition, fates, and philosophies. Is the storyline preordained? Is chance involved, or does a divine hand guide us? What roles for fealty and friendship? What for mercy and environment? And how exactly do we understand evil in a universe without religion? Now, these are just a few of the questions Kocher addresses as he examines each of the realms, races, the complexity of Aragorn, a terrific chapter, and the value or lack thereof in presuming simple allegory from Tolkien's life work. At the work's close, Kocher looks closely at 7 other writings of Tolkien to reveal their connections to the central Lord of the Rings as well. Now, there is a ton of Tolkien writing out there, but Kocher's, written way back in 1972, it's going to stay on my shelf.